All right, I'll go ahead and kick us off. So, welcome back to Road to Wellbeing, the show where we explore what it really takes to build workplaces that support health, happiness, and human connection. On today's episode, we'll be diving into the science of how our brains are wired to focus on the negative, and more importantly, how we can retrain ourselves and our workplaces to lean into the good. So today we're joined by Bill Bellinger. He's the CEO of Hillbright, an on demand mental wellness platform for employers of all sizes and a partner of Wellness 360 as well. And he's an expert in positive psychology and emotional resilience. And we'll be having a conversation about overcoming negativity bias, practicing positive psychology in real life, and building more emotionally intelligent cultures that support well being from the inside out. Thanks for joining us today, Bill.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. So let's get started with the basics. So, what exactly is negativity bias and why does it happen?
Yeah, so negativity bias is a term that was first coined in 2001, but it's been around for longer in psychology, also in philosophy. It basically describes the brain's tendency to focus more on negative experiences and emotions than positive ones. So this happens in a few different ways. We tend to, in our environment, give more attention to negative stimulus. We tend to be more influenced by negative experiences than positive experiences. And then negative experiences tend to impact us on a brain level more deeply. So that means the memories of negative experiences get encoded at a deeper level. So even in sleep, when we're rehearsing our day and having emotions, they tend to be more negative. So the reason that it happens, at least the theory, which I think makes a lot of sense, is it's a protective mechanism. So in
Mhm.
some ways, I actually don't love the term negativity bias because it sounds like it's a defect of the brain, but it's not. It's You could think of it more as survival bias, that our brains are biased to try to keep us safe and to live. So from an evolutionary perspective, there was a much bigger consequences from negative experiences than from positive ones. So, for example, if you stuck your hand in a hot fire, it could be life threatening, or if you didn't get away from a predator, those things could kill you. Whereas a positive experience, like let's say you discovered a new source of food, it's great, it's positive, but it's not immediately life threatening.
Mhm.
So because of that, the theory is that our brains kind of evolved to give more weight, pay more attention to negative inputs than to positive ones. So that's kind of like the basic idea.
So I love that you kind of tied it back to like evolution. I think sometimes, especially when we look at like social media, it can be made to feel a little, I guess, judging for people. If you see the negative, there seems to be judgment for being more negative. But I love that you kind of said that that's how the brain just naturally works, and you tied it back to kind of, um, as you mentioned, evolution, development overall. And you mentioned a few examples from an evolutionary standpoint. So where can we start to see this negativity bias show up in like our day to day?
So yeah, it's similar to a lot of the things that we've evolved to do. So yeah, another example is kind of bringing it into the body. We've evolved to move a lot. So that's just kind of the baseline. So when we are sitting at a desk all day, we have all these health problems because that's not what our body is adapted to. Um, this proclivity to focus on the negative shows up in the same way. Again, we tend to focus on negative feedback more. So I actually had a funny experience this morning where I teach some courses on things like attachment theory, and I got some reviews last night and this morning. Two of them were extremely positive, and one of them was like decent. I just
Mhm.
noticed I immediately start fixating on the one that I didn't get a 5-star review. It doesn't really
Mhm.
matter, it doesn't impact me that much. And, objectively, I got a lot of positive feedback, but it's just this proclivity to focus on the negative. I think with the news and social media, especially, unfortunately, really hijacked this tendency of the human brain. So, using the
Mhm.
example of social media, the goal of a social media company is to keep you engaged because that's their model. And they've learned a long time ago that negative news and negative emotional states keep people engaged more. So in a way, it's, we don't have the immediate survival level threats all the time like we did,
Mhm.
many years ago. It's pretty rare for most of us to be in a life-threatening situation, during the course of a normal week. But we're also
Mhm.
just flooded with all this technology that is designed to kind of keep us in negative states. So it's, in some ways, it's easier than it used to be. In some ways, it's much more difficult than it used to be. Um, this happens in relationships too, in intimate relationships and in professional relationships. We tend to give more weight to the negative. So we might, with our spouse, have a great day and have all these positive things, but we might have one fight. We tend to fixate on that a little bit too much. So it basically shows up in like a myriad of ways. There's really no limit in the ways that it shows up.
Thanks for sharing those examples. And you kind of touched on what my next question was going to be. So you mentioned it comes up in our relationships, both personal and professional. What are some other ways that negativity bias shows up in the workplace?
Yeah, there's a few things that have come to mind recently. One, and we can kind of touch on the positive psychology part towards the end, but I want to touch on that a little bit now. Some of the research on the differences with emotional states is that negative emotional states tend to restrict our awareness. Now, again, that makes sense. So, if somebody bursts into my office right now and I have to fight for my life, everything else has to take a back seat to that. So, I get tunnel vision and I have to stay safe. Positive emotional experiences broaden awareness. And there's a lot of tests that have shown this in studies where people are able to see possibilities they couldn't see before. They're able to make social connections they couldn't make in negative states. They even perform better on mathematical tests and brain quit like puzzles and all different types of cognitive tasks. So another thing that I see a lot in the workplace is, especially when there's a lot of change happening, our instinct is to get into the negative and to be fearful and afraid. And we know that limits what we're able to see as possible. So, from a strategic perspective for a business, people that are able to consciously cultivate positive emotional states, in my opinion, they have an advantage because they're able to see possibilities that the other competitors couldn't see if they're kind of stuck in a fight or flight response. And again, with the modern world and social media, where a lot of us are in that mild level of fight or flight response a lot of the time. So again, there's a lot of different ways it shows up, but that's something that kind of comes to mind.
I like that you mentioned the constant state of like our nervous system is pretty much being activated all the time because social media. And I think one of the big differences that we sometimes don't realize is that, like, yes, our bodies in the past may have been able to handle stress differently than now because it was like one singular stressor instead of this like stream of stressors constantly kind of being brought to the forefront. And you started to touch on some things like positive psychology and how that starts to expand the horizons. So, can you tell me a little bit more about positive psychology and how, like, people can make that shift in the impact of creating that shift?
Yeah, so positive psychology is, it's a super interesting movement. I believe it started in 1999, and Martin Seligman was the head of the APA at the time. And it was interesting. So when he took control of the APA, that was one of the things he really wanted to spearhead. It was focusing more on positive rather than negative. So I believe the ratio at the time was for every 16 studies on what goes wrong with the mind. So, anxiety, depression, personality disorders, there's only one for positive states and what goes right with the mind. So, it's funny, but even in the field of psychology, they fell into the negativity bias where there's this fixation on trauma and what goes wrong. And there really was not a lot of attention given to, well, what happens for people that are kind of at the upper levels of peak performance and joy and meaning and flow. So that was his attempt to kind of reverse that a little bit. Now, I also just want to state too, I'm a big fan of this term toxic positivity, where people want to be positive all the time and get rid of the negative. That's not what positive psychology is. I think there might be some misrepresentations. It's very much a way of balancing the negativity bias within the field. So, on a practical perspective, I'm a fan of the model where if you're a therapist and a client comes to work with you, you should focus on their immediate concern, which is usually they're coming with a problem. And it's more towards the end of therapy, then you're really trying to equip them with other tools to cultivate positivity, to have greater purpose and meaning and flow. But generally, there's a lot of different practices and approaches, but we could say that some of the main goals of positive psychology are to increase positive emotional states overall. So there's an understanding that our spontaneously unfolding emotional states tend to be more negative. So with practices like gratitude and visualization and compassion meditation, we can shift that so we start to have more positive emotional states. There's also a focus on increasing flow states. So when that feeling of being in the flow, which is a peak performance understanding. And then also more broadly is developing meaning and purpose. So that is different than emotional states. It's more helping people to articulate like a bigger purpose to their work and to their life. There's a lot of great research on that too, and how that fosters resilience. So again, none of these are saying that you shouldn't get treated for anxiety and depression or anything like that, but I think they're good counterbalances. And then normal people who aren't suffering from any, particular psychiatric disorder or anything can benefit from those practices too.
Uh, the mentioning of toxic positivity really hit a nail on the head for me. I think a lot of people, when they hear positive psychology, that's the first thing that they jump to is it's only thinking happy thoughts and trying to push all the bad thoughts or bad things to the side. I love that you highlighted that it's kind of practicing gratitude, all those different practices, and that there almost needs to be a little bit of a balance because, as you mentioned, with negativity bias, that's what kept us alive
Yeah.
for years as we went through evolution. But now that we're in this current space where we're constantly overloaded by negativity, we have to be a little more purposeful with finding those silver linings or those positivity practices. And you started listing a few of them and mentioning some instances of how positive psychology can start impacting the lives of others. You started speaking about finding meaning and like purpose and how that's a practice of positive psychology. And I can see that really relating to like the workplace or the workforce. So, what are
Mm-hmm.
some ways that maybe like managers or employers can start to focus on these different ways to incorporate positive psychology practices in their workplaces?
Yeah, and just to before I jump to that, just to piggyback on the one more thing about the toxic positivity, which is related to this question in the workplace as well. Dr. Barbara Fredrickson did some really interesting research that I like, and there's been a little bit of controversy over the exact numbers, so I wouldn't take it too rigidly. But her
Mhm.
idea is that the ideal ratio for human flourishing is a ratio of 3 positive emotional states to every 1 negative. So just in terms of the normal course of the day, most of us are way out of line with that and much more in the negative states. But her
I've never
research did
heard that
show,
before. That's
what's
so
that?
interesting. I've never heard that before. That's really
Yeah, it's
interesting.
interesting. But her research showed when people are too much only trying to stay in positive, they don't do well actually, because you start to get out of touch with reality and you're repressing negative emotions that are valid, that should be expressed and felt. So it's just about gently tipping that balance where you're in positive states a little bit more of the time. And I think it's an intuitive thing. I think for each person, you can kind of feel into where you're at and try to be honest with yourself. And then in terms of the meaning making, I think it's more about for people in the workplace is trying to connect with a bigger vision and purpose for why are you in the field that you're in? Why are you doing the work that you're doing? So one of my teachers, who actually passed away a few years ago, Dr. Daniel Brown, he did a lot of trainings for judges in Massachusetts, as an example, using positive psychology. And judges have a really hard career, and they're seeing repeat offenders come in and out, and they're seeing kind of the worst elements of humanity. So they get burned out a lot. So one of the practices he did with them, which people can do, now, just listening to how I describe it, I'll get the abbreviated version is that you're writing down a vision for the big purpose in your life. So what is it? The central purpose that you have in your life that connects to all the things that you do. So in the case of the judges, it was usually something that was either humanitarian, like they deeply believed in justice, or they wanted to help underserved communities, or it could be spiritual, where it's a connection to their spiritual practice. But it has to be something that's bigger than you. You're helping something that is transcendent in some way. So again, it could be secular or religious, it doesn't really matter. And just by having people to take time to write that out and articulate that and spend some time in that energy, then when they go back to work, when they can keep recalling that, what it feels like to be in that, all of the normal things that they do become infused with meaning. So we all have things that we have to do at our job that we don't like, and we have to do taxes and work with people that are difficult and all this type of stuff. And if you don't have a meaning, it's much more likely to burn you out. But if you have a vision in your mind, especially in our community, which has a lot of wellness oriented people, I would imagine that the vision a lot of people have is to help others and to help people to be healthy and happy. When you can really connect with that and stay attuned to that, the idea is that everything can become imbued with meaning in your daily life. So even the doing the taxes and the meetings you don't want to go to, when you connect it to the bigger purpose, it becomes meaningful, and people tend to get burned out less. So yeah, I think that's a really important practice. It's different than the emotional piece, which is also important. But I think it's worth people exploring and articulating, at least at one point in their life. What do they think the big meaning of their work is? And articulating that can be very helpful.
I think that when we think of mental well being, we do automatically, once again, that negativity bias hits. And we automatically think of the anxiety, depression, or just like the emotional health and getting over that hump, but not that aspirational part of mental well being. So I love that you highlighted that kind of having that foundation of your purpose or your meaning and then being able to link everything back to it helps to reduce those feelings of burnout. I can say from what I've seen just from friends who are in the field and who are in other industries where when you're in wellness, I think we do all kind of have that. We want to help people, and that's always kind of driving us. But as I look at some of my friends in other industries, I see that disconnect happening. Um, and it's interesting because no one speaks about purpose and meaning and, like, what is this larger reason why you're doing these things? And society kind of tends to be more based on that. Well, what goal? Or very goal oriented, but not aspirational in a way.
Mhm.
I'm trying to find a way to make that difference. Does that make sense?
It does. And there's a few things that come to mind too. So one of the other ways to look at this is our culture has become hyper individualistic, and there's
Mm-hmm.
not a lot of evidence that that makes people happy. Most of the evidence is that it makes people miserable, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And so there's studies that people, when they'll do writing samples, the more they talk about themselves, the higher that's linked to negative mental health outcomes. So I think is a myth in our culture, is the way you get happy and the American dream is you just have to struggle and make tons of money and then one day you'll be happy. There's really not a lot of evidence of that. The evidence is more people that have a bigger meaning and care about other people tend to be happier more of the time. So there's been some really interesting research on compassion meditation. So when you're consciously generating positive feelings towards other people, the people that participate in those studies are considered some of the happiest people ever studied, at least according to the brain imaging. So again, it's like we get it backwards sometimes. So when we're really focusing on the well-being of ourselves and other people, we tend to be happier. Um, yeah, and I think the other idea too in positive psychology is another myth that gets dispelled, is that we have this idea we'll struggle and we're going to work really hard, we're going to grind, you're going to work 80 hours, and one day you'll get to the end of the road and you'll have all this money and then you'll be happy. The positive psychology research says it's actually the exact opposite. It's that when you learn to cultivate positive emotional states now and learn to be happy every day, you tend to be more likely to be successful. because those positive emotional states are linked to better performance, better health, more social connections. So yeah, I think a lot of these baseline ideas that we have in our culture get challenged by the research. So I think it's good news ultimately that having empathy and being happy is a better route than kind of being selfish and narrow-minded.
It feels like watching like a Disney like all the Disney kind of fairy tales have a little bit of truth to them. The more you work together, the more successful. So I kind of like that you mentioned that aspect of it. Now, you started mentioning a few different positive psychology exercises. What are your like favorite that you would recommend somebody who's like, okay, I'm ready to take control, shift out of this negative space? What would you recommend they start with?
My personal favorite off the top of my head is anything involving gratitude. I think is kind of like a cheat code working with the human brain. It's like very easy, in my opinion. It's not a big time investment to cultivate gratitude, and there's just an enormous amount of benefits from it. So Martin Seligman, who I mentioned earlier, he had some of his students do gratitude journals. And again, I don't like how some of this gets presented in popular culture now, because we're not trying to ever reject the negative, but just in a very simple way. I believe it was every night you don't want to spend an hour on it. You might spend 5 minutes on
Yeah.
it. Just list at least three positive things that happened to you, or things that you're grateful for that day. And I believe they did that for only 21 days, and the impact was, I believe, more than antidepressants on average. So it's very powerful. It works very quickly, and it's interesting because you're using a cognitive element where you're starting to change your thinking patterns. So then you start to focus on that more. But you also want to do it as an emotional practice where in the moment you're cultivating the feeling of gratitude. So you want to really keep that in the body and enjoy it. So that's one of them I try to do every day. So my wife and I will do that and just say what we're grateful for. And it's really interesting because there's some days where I'm burned out. I had a long work day. We have a toddler, so that's, tons of energy. So there's just certain days by the end of the day, you're kind of a little bit grumpy, or you're just thinking of all the stuff you have to do the next day. And just for a few minutes, when I take time to reflect on what I'm grateful for, it's like I remember I've totally forgot all these really positive things that happened to me today, or these moments where people were very kind to me that I was very quick to gloss over. So that I think is the easiest, because you don't need to meditate, you don't need to be in therapy. I would really encourage people experiment with that, and I would give it like a month or so. And if you're in a relationship too, you could either do it on your own or you could do it with your partner, where you're both doing it every night or every morning, and you could talk about things you're grateful for in the relationship. And then you also can really extend what you're grateful for, because we often think we're only going to be grateful if we have a big promotion or some big thing happens. But when you start to expand, I'm grateful that I have like a stable source of income, or I have food and water. And there's lots of people that don't have that. And it's a miracle that we're able to have that every day. It starts to really change your perspective. So there's other practices we can discuss, but I think that one is the most accessible and has a lot of evidence on the efficacy.
I love that. And you're right. It's something that's so simple that can take less than a minute sometimes of your
Yeah.
day, that people can really get started with. And it doesn't even take too much of, like, it doesn't impact too much of everything else you have going on. So we're coming up on our last few minutes. So for my final question, what are some ways that managers and HR leaders can incorporate positive psychology in the workplace?
So this is a tricky one where I think we need to balance the positive psychology with also just an understanding of emotions in general.
Mhm.
So there's research when managers are giving feedback to their employees that it's not a surprise they tend to focus more on the negative part of the feedback. So I think there's some HR leaders and managers that get afraid to give any negative feedback. And then they kind of want to only bookend with positive feedback. And I think people can kind of see through that a little bit. But there is other research more from the traditional psychology field that when people voice a negative, it diffuses it. So this is why if you feel upset or you're grieving, you have a difficult experience, and you talk to somebody about it, you feel better. So you that's why therapy works, because when you talk about something, the activation of the amygdala goes down. So what I found in the workplace is people are very afraid to address the elephant in the room, and unfortunately, it gives it more energy. So that's what I would recommend, is just to lean into, if there's an elephant in the room, to name it. So if, let's say somebody has a performance review and the person seems disappointed and no one wants to say it, just having a little bit of courage. It seems like you're really disappointed about this. Or it seems like you were expecting something else. And that's coming from a place of empathy, where you're trying to tune into what is the person feeling, and you're just naming it. And if you're wrong, it doesn't matter, because they'll probably correct you, and then you can say, oh, I was wrong. It sounds like this is what you're experiencing. And you can do that until you get it right. And normally when you do that, you'll notice there almost be a shift in the posture. The person will almost exhale and let go and be like, that's right. Yeah. And in that sense, they feel seen. So I would say, just to be able to talk about what's in the room and give some space for that on the emotional level can be enormously helpful. And don't sugarcoat it or try to say, oh, well, if you have legitimate negative feedback, and try to sandwich it in positive things. I would just try to discuss it and allow the person to feel disappointed, and don't be afraid of that, because when it's named, it goes away and it feels better. Then I would separate that from making different interactions more about positivity. So that is just, occasionally giving people little surprises, just little things. It could be, a $10 gift card, or just an email of recognition. That goes a long way. And I think in the healthiest cultures, they can do both. You can talk about the elephant in the room. You can talk about negative emotions and not be afraid of them. And you can spontaneously give good feedback and rewards and recognition, and let people know that you're grateful, but doing it in an authentic way. And it tends to become contagious. So that's another thing about emotional states from some of this research. They're contagious. So we've probably all had that experience where you walk into an environment and there's a bad vibe, and we pick up on it. And that happens in the workplace too. So again, some people tend to either, it's always toxic and negative and gossipy, is one end of the spectrum, or the other end of the spectrum is everyone's afraid to talk about anything negative, and it's super bubbly and toxic positivity. So my personal opinion is, like, the healthiest workplaces, you can have healthy conflict, we can talk about disagreements, we're going to give space for people to have difficult feelings, and then in different interactions, we're going to make a conscious, deliberate effort to show people we're grateful for them, they're appreciated, to have positive interactions. So that's my 2 cents.
I love that. And I love how aligned it is with some of the things we've been working on too at Wellness 360,
Mm,
is providing like options for those managers and administrators to be able to show that appreciation more often. Because as you mentioned, a lot of the times those conversations don't happen between, leadership and an employee until it is that kind of review period.
yeah,
So providing more of those opportunities to say, hey, we see you, you're doing great, or hey, you've been here for a while, happy birthday, just something very small to still show that recognition. And we're trying to make it like easier for them to do that too. Because as you mentioned, it just helps the workforce all around. So with
yeah,
that,
exactly. And with the review period, everybody's nervous about getting a performance review. You can't change
mhm.
that. So you're just having empathy. Hey, this is scary, or this is nerve wracking. And then like you're saying, on a different time, you make it easy for them to have those positive interactions. So
Mhm.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Awesome sauce. So that is our time. I'd love to thank you for joining us today, Bill, and I'd love to thank you all for joining today's call. Make sure you stay tuned to our LinkedIn for our next episode, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.